A man is sitting at a metal table in a room with no windows. He is not young. He hasn't been young in a very long time. His hands are weathered, mapped with the kinds of lines that only decades of reckoning can carve into skin. He is calculating something, not on paper, not aloud. In the quiet private arithmetic of a man who has spent years measuring the distance between the life he had and the life he wanted and the life he ruined. His name is George Jung. You may have seen the movie. You may remember Johnny Depp, slick-haired and sunburnished, steering a boat through turquoise water, cash in duffel bags, women in bikinis. An entire era distilled into something almost glamorous. You remember the ending? When the camera pulls back and the music rises and you feel something complicated, something that isn't quite sadness and isn't quite admiration, something in between that. Hollywood knows exactly how to manufacture. But that was a film. This is the man at his peak. George Jung moved so much cocaine into the United States that federal prosecutors would later estimate his network was responsible for importing roughly 85% of all the cocaine that entered this country in the late 1970s and early 1980s. At his peak, he was worth an estimated $100 million. At his peak, he flew in private planes, lived in houses with ocean views, and carried himself with the particular arrogance of a man who believes the rules of the world do not apply to him. He spent most of the rest of his life in prison. He died at 78 years old in the same town where he was born. He died in a hospice bed in Weymouth, Massachusetts, with liver failure and kidney failure, doing the slow, quiet work that decades of excess, paranoia, incarceration, and loss had prepared them for. Between the boy and the dying man, there is a story about America, about money, about the dream we tell ourselves and the price it extracts when we pursue it through the wrong doors. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If this story is already pulling at you, if you felt something in those opening lines, then this channel is built for you. We spend real time with real stories. We don't rush. We don't skip the parts that are hard to sit with. If that's the kind of storytelling that matters to you, hit subscribe right now. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And if you want to support what we do here, a like takes 2 seconds, and it means the world. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. What time is it where you are? There's something about a story like this that hits differently at 2 in the morning, when the house is quiet and the world feels far away, and you can sit with the weight of something real. Tell me you're here. Just say, Boston George. That's all I need. Now, let's go back to the beginning, all the way back to a small town in Massachusetts, where a boy was watching his father work himself into the ground and learning exactly the wrong lesson from it. The year is 1942. The place is Weymouth, Massachusetts. Weymouth sits about 12 miles south of Boston, wedged between the South Shore and the harbor, a town that had been working class for as long as anyone could remember. The kind of town where men went to work before dawn and came home after dark and spent the hours in between doing the honest and thankless labor that built the American middle, shipbuilding once, defense contracts during the war, small businesses, trade work, the ordinary engines of ordinary American striving. On August 6, 1942, George Jacob Jung was born into this world. His father was Frederick Jung. His mother was Ernin. They were not wealthy people. Frederick ran a small plumbing business, and he ran it the way men of his generation and class ran everything, with his hands, with his back, with the unspoken conviction that hard work would eventually be rewarded. that the American contract between effort and outcome was real, that the rules of the game were fair if you played them honestly enough. You need to understand something about that belief. In the years after World War II, in the town south of Boston, it wasn't naive. Weymouth in the 1940s and 1950s was a town organized around the premise of industriousness. There was a paper mill, there was a shoe factory, there were the trades, plumbing, carpentry, electrical work, the invisible infrastructure of a society that needed maintaining, the labor of men who made the physical world function and were compensated for it modestly and without ceremony. The houses on the residential streets were small and well kept, the kind of houses where the lawn got mowed on Saturdays and the car got washed on Sundays, and the rhythms of the week were orderly and predictable, and, in their own way, dignified. This was the world Frederick Jung moved through. He owned his small plumbing business with the kind of pride that working men take in ownership, the knowledge that it was his, that he had built it, that the name on the side of the truck was his name and whatever it represented. Good days and bad, it represented him. He was not a complainer. Men of his generation and background did not complain. Not as a rule. You worked, you provided. You got up the next morning and worked again. And whatever anxiety lived in you about the distance between what you had and what you needed was kept private, held inside, administered quietly in the small hours when the family was asleep. George watched this. Children always watch more than their parents know. He watched his father's hands, the calluses, the cuts that never fully healed, the specific physical testimony of labor accumulated over years. He watched the way his father carried himself when the business was struggling, the slight stiffening of the jaw, the shortened sentences at dinner, the way a man's dignity contracts under financial pressure, even when he refuses to name the pressure aloud. He understood what he was watching. He was watching the limits of honest work, not the failure of honest work. His father was not a failure in the moral sense. He was watching the ceiling. It was the operating faith of an entire generation. These were men who had watched their fathers survive the Depression, who had watched their country survive the war, who had been told, and who genuinely believed, that a man who worked hard and kept his nose clean and raised his children right would be rewarded in time, that the ledger would balance, that the American dream was not a myth but a promise. Frederick Jung worked hard. He kept his nose clean. He raised his children. The ledger never balanced. This is important to understand. Not because Frederick was a failure in any human sense. He was not. He was a decent man who tried, but the business struggled. There were lean years and then leaner years. There were months when the household ran on anxiety and coffee, and the kind of silence that children absorb like weather, storing it in the deep places where character is actually formed. George watched his father come home exhausted. George watched his father pay bills and then worry about the next set of bills. George watched his father do everything that was supposed to work and watched it not work. I never want to be poor, George Jung would say years later. In the clipped, matter-of-fact way, he said most things. It sounds simple. It sounds like 100 other origin stories. But pull it apart and look at what it actually contains. It doesn't say he wanted to be rich, not exactly. It says he never wanted to be what his father was. Not poor Frederick Jung specifically, but poor like that, struggling like that, tethered to a system that asked everything of you and gave back just enough to keep you grinding. This distinction matters. It is the seed of everything that came after. George was a bright kid. His classmates at Weymouth High School remembered him as a natural leader, the kind of boy who filled a room when he walked into it, who made people want to follow him somewhere without necessarily knowing where he was going. He played football with enough skill to be noticed. He was charming in the way that certain people are charming as a kind of metabolism, not performed, not calculated, just a natural electricity in social situations that made him magnetic and occasionally dangerous to others who didn't see the current running under the surface. He was not, by his own admission, a dedicated student. He was restless in the way that intelligent people, without sufficient challenge, become restless, fidgeting against the smallness of the world they've been placed in, sensing that something else exists beyond the classroom windows and the tidy rows of desks. He graduated from Weymouth High in 1961, and for a brief period he enrolled at the University of Southern Mississippi, where he vaguely considered studying advertising. Let that sit for a moment. The boy who would eventually become one of the most accomplished salesmen of a prohibited product in American history, who would develop distribution networks, manage client relationships, and move inventory at a scale that would have impressed the boardroom of any Fortune 500 company, once thought he might go into advertising. He dropped out, he drifted, he worked odd jobs. He moved with the current of the early 1960s, which was already beginning to pull at the edges of the world his father believed in. But counterculture was not yet a counterculture. It was just a restlessness, a gathering wave, the earliest tremors of a cultural earthquake that would reshape everything about how Americans understood freedom and authority and what a life was supposed to look like. George Jung, 20 years old and unsatisfied in ways he couldn't yet articulate, could feel it. He began using marijuana. This requires context, because we're speaking now from a distance of more than 60 years, and the marijuana landscape has shifted so dramatically that it's easy to lose the texture of what it meant in the early 1960s to smoke. It was illegal everywhere. It was associated in the public mind, in the media, in the conversations of respectable people, in the speeches of politicians, with jazz musicians and beatniks and communists, in the kinds of moral looseness that threatened everything Frederick Jung's generation had built. It was not a recreational substance. It was a marker of who you were willing to be. And George Jung discovered that he didn't much care about markers. He sold some of what he bought, not aggressively, not yet with any particular plan, just the organic, offhand commerce of a young man who liked to be the person with the supply when people needed it. He was good at it. He liked the way it felt to be useful, to be the node through which other people passed on their way to something they wanted. There was nothing ideological about it. There was barely even anything financial about it yet. But the wheels, as he would later say, were turning. He was working towards something. He didn't know what yet. He was just a boy from Weymouth, with his father's broken dream decaying inside him, and a sense that the world contained something more than what his street could show him. Something faster, something bigger, something that hadn't been built by men who came home exhausted and still got nowhere. Imagine standing there, in Weymouth in the early 1960s, 20 years old, watching the leaves turn in the fall, the same way they turned every fall, hearing the same sounds, the same conversations, the same measured ambitions of a town that had decided what was possible and settled comfortably inside those walls. Imagine knowing, not thinking, not hoping, but knowing in the way that certain people know certain things, that you are not going to stay. The question was never whether George Jung would leave Weymouth. The question was only where he would go and what he would find when he got there. In 1967, the answer arrived. A childhood friend came to visit. They talked, and something that had been building slowly for years suddenly accelerated into motion. The friend mentioned California, and just like that, the course of American drug history changed. George was 24 when the California idea crystallized. He was living on Cape Cod in Eastham, Massachusetts, when the friend from the University of Massachusetts arrived and described the price differential that would become the hinge of George Jung's entire life. The Cape in the mid-1960s was still essentially a seasonal landscape, not yet the real estate commodity it would later become, still operating on the rhythms of fishing and tourism and the quiet, off-season months when the population thinned and the wind off the Atlantic had the particular authority that empty places invite. It was a beautiful nowhere, and nowhere, however beautiful, was not where George intended to stay. He packed what he had. He pointed himself west. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me slow down, because before we follow George west, we need to fully absorb what he was carrying with him out of Weymouth. Not drugs, not money, something older and more corrosive than either of those things. He was carrying his father's disappointment, not Frederick's disappointment in George. Frederick's disappointment in the system, in the premise, in the bargain, in the architecture of the American promise that had asked so much and delivered so little. George had watched it closely, had studied it the way children study the things that frighten them most, and he had drawn from it a conclusion that was ruthless in its clarity. The rules were not designed for people like us. He never said it that way. He didn't have to. It lived in him like a compass, pointing away from everything his father had accepted. And when the road west opened up, he walked through it without looking back. The year is 1967. The place is Manhattan Beach, California. Understand what that means. Understand what kind of rupture that is to leave Weymouth. Massachusetts, in the dead of New England winter, with the gray sky and the gray water, and the gray certainty that tomorrow will look exactly like today, and arrive in Southern California in the middle of the long, strange summer of love. That was rewriting everything about what this country thought it was. The light alone must have been disorienting, not just metaphorically, literally. The quality of light in Southern California, that particular gold that pours off, Pacific in the afternoon, and coats everything it touches in. Something that feels almost like permission. It was unlike anything the South, shore of Massachusetts, had ever offered a young man. It said, "You are not the same person who left." It said, "The rules here are different." It said, "Everything is possible if you are willing to reach for it." George Jung reached. Manhattan Beach was not a rich town in 1967. It was a beach community. Surfers, musicians, college students, Vietnam veterans home too early and too changed, young men and women who had migrated there from everywhere in America to find themselves in proximity to the ocean and the counterculture and each other. It had the texture of a place where the old structures hadn't fully arrived yet, where you could exist in the gaps between what society expected of you and what you actually wanted to do. George moved in. He found his people. One of those people was Richard Barral. Richard Barral would become known to the people in George's world by the nickname Tuna. He was a friend, an early associate, a fellow traveler in the emerging culture of the California coast. The details of his background, like those of many people in this story, blur under the weight of time and the mythology that accumulates around a life, like George Jung's. What matters is what Tuna represented: a connection, a community, a set of relationships that would eventually function as the scaffolding upon which a criminal enterprise was constructed. But at the beginning, it was not criminal, not really, not in any way that felt consequential. At the beginning, it was just marijuana. George was using and occasionally selling in small amounts when the friend who had first mentioned California came to visit him in Manhattan Beach. The friend was attending the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. They were sitting together. The story goes, a punch bowl of marijuana on the table for anyone to help themselves. When the friend asked how much the pot was worth, about $60 a kilo, George told him. The friend looked at him. Back in Amherst, he said, that same kilo sells for $300. The wheels began to turn. This is where the story changes. This is the hinge point, the specific, unremarkable moment in an apartment in Manhattan Beach when a working-class kid from Weymouth did the math that would eventually reshape the American drug landscape. $60 in California, $300 in Massachusetts. A price differential of $240 per kilo, multiplied by whatever quantity a man with initiative and a car, and no particular attachment to legality, was willing to move. The arithmetic was intoxicating, possibly more intoxicating than the marijuana itself. George Jung had found his calling. What happened next was not immediate transformation. It was gradual. It was entrepreneurial in the most basic sense. A man identifying an inefficiency in a market and positioning himself to exploit it. He started small. He would buy marijuana in California at local prices and drive it back to New England, selling to college students in and around Amherst, to friends of friends. The network expanded the way all networks expand, through trust and word of mouth, and the simple fact of being the person who reliably had what people wanted. He was good at this, genuinely good. He had a salesman's instincts, the ability to read a room, to calibrate the pitch, to make the transaction feel comfortable and safe, to build the kind of loyalty that comes not from fear, but from genuine satisfaction. His customers liked him. They came back. They told others, let me slow down here, because there is something psychologically significant happening in this period that deserves attention. George Jung had grown up watching his father perform the proper rituals of American economic life and get almost nothing for it. And now here he was, a dropout, a drifter, a young man with no credentials and no plan, making more money in a week than his father made in a month. He would later say it plainly. He was making more money than he had ever dreamed of, more than he had imagined a person like him was allowed to make. What does that do to a person? What happens when the universe confirms your suspicion that the official system is a trap, that the people who follow the rules are suckers, that the real money lives in the margins, in the gaps, in the places where authority can't quite reach? What happens when you are 25 years old and suddenly wealthy and the sun is shining and the ocean is right there and everything that was supposed to be impossible has turned out to be embarrassingly easy? You don't stop. That's what happens. You don't slow down and examine the architecture of what you're building. You accelerate. George accelerated. The motorhome runs to Amherst became regular flights. The flights required innovation. You couldn't walk through an airport carrying a bag full of marijuana and expect not to be noticed. This is where Barbara Buckley enters the story. Barbara was a flight attendant, George's girlfriend at the time, and she became the first logistical innovation in what would eventually become a sophisticated smuggling operation. Flight attendants had unusual access to aircraft, to storage areas, to the informal economy of people who moved through airports constantly and were, consequently, almost never stopped. Barbara transported marijuana in her suitcases on commercial flights. It worked, but suitcases had limits. You could move pounds that way, not tons. And George Jung was already thinking in tons. He found a connection in Mexico. He traveled to Puerto Vallarta, where through a series of introductions involving an American woman he met on the coast, he eventually found his way to the son of a Mexican general who could supply marijuana in serious quantities at serious discounts. Puerto Vallarta in the late 1960s was not yet the resort destination it would eventually become. It was a coastal town of fishermen and farmers. Heat that sat on everything in the afternoons. The smell of salt and vegetation, and the specific productive informality of a place that had not yet been commodified by tourism. George moved through it with the ease of a man for whom social situations had always been navigable. He had the traveler's gift for making himself comprehensible across language barriers, for using body language and charm and the universal currency of apparent goodwill to build bridges that words alone couldn't span. In a business built entirely on personal trust, being a people person was the most essential qualification there was. The connection in Puerto Vallarta provided supply at a price that made his previous California acquisitions look laughably expensive. He was now buying marijuana at approximately $20 a kilo and selling it for $300 in Massachusetts. For every kilo that made the journey, he kept $280 minus logistics. And the logistics, once the system was refined, cost surprisingly little relative to the return. The math was almost obscene. The operation that developed from this was impressive in its ingenuity. George and his associates, men he trusted, men with a particular combination of nerve and discretion that this kind of work required, used private single-engine planes to fly loads of between 600 and 800 pounds out of a secluded coastal point near Puerto Vallarta. The planes landed on dry lake beds near Palm Springs, California, where the cargo was offloaded, repackaged, and moved east by road. By the early 1970s, George Jung and his network were moving quantities of marijuana that made the DEA's intelligence reports on domestic trafficking take notice. The operation had additional key personnel beyond George himself. There were the pilots, men with genuine aviation skill who knew the Gulf Coast intimately, who understood the particular art of flying below radar at night, who had the nerves that this kind of flying demanded. There was the ground crew in Mexico, the men who loaded product under cover of darkness along the coast near Puerto Vallarta and retreated into the anonymity of the shoreline as the planes climbed north into the night sky. And there were the distributors in New England, men who received product, broke it down for the college towns and cities, managed the relationships with end buyers, and ensured that the money flowed back through the chain reliably and without drama. George was not a dictator in this network. He was its social architect. He kept people paid. He kept people loyal. The men who worked with him generally liked him, and that affection was one of the operation's most significant assets. Willing participants commit fewer errors, keep secrets better, and stay loyal longer under pressure than reluctant ones. George Jung understood this without ever having studied it. At the height of the marijuana operation, George Jung and his associates were reportedly clearing $250,000 a month. $250,000 a month. His father had worked himself to exhaustion, running a plumbing business, and never got close to that in a year. George drove nice cars. He wore nice clothes. He rented houses in beautiful places and filled them with people who found him magnetic and generous and exciting. He was 28 years old and felt, for the first time in his life, that the universe had confirmed something he had always suspected about himself, that he was not a man meant for small things. What he didn't understand, what almost no one at that stage of the game understands, is that the universe was not confirming anything. It was simply showing him the view from the top of a wave. And all waves, regardless of how high they rise, eventually break. But in 1970, 1971, 1972, the wave was still climbing, and from where George was standing, it looked like it would climb forever. He could not have been more wrong. But that realization was still years away. For now, the sun was shining, the money was flowing, and a boy from Weymouth had become something he never could have imagined, standing on the shores of Massachusetts looking south and dreaming. He had become a businessman, the wrong kind, but a businessman nonetheless. A man who had found a market, developed a supply chain, built distribution networks, managed relationships, and grown an enterprise from nothing into something that operated at continental scale. If the product had been legal, if the context had been different, if he had been born 20 years later in a different America, the skills he demonstrated would have made him a candidate for a business school, case study rather than a federal indictment. That is not a defense of what he did. It is an observation about the particular intersection of talent and circumstance and timing that shapes every life, criminal and otherwise. You need to understand something about the American marijuana trade in the early 1970s. It was not what we now imagine when we think about drug trafficking. There were no cartels. There was no systematic violence. There were no enforcers with automatic weapons standing guard over product in industrial warehouses. The marijuana trade of that era operated on something that George Jung himself would later describe as a handshake business, a network of personal relationships built on trust, reputation, and the shared understanding that everyone involved was breaking a law that most of them considered essentially unjust. Any marijuana transaction I ever did with anyone, George Jung said in a PBS Frontline interview, there were never any guns involved. Ever. It was simply just, a handshake business and a trust factor. This distinction will matter later. Keep it in mind. By the early 1970s, George's operation had outgrown its improvised origins. The motorhomes were long gone. The suitcases in Barbara's overhead compartment were a relic of a more cautious time. What George was running now was a proper smuggling operation, aerial, logistically sophisticated, and operating at a scale that put him in a different category from the dealers and distributors who populated the lower tiers of the trade. The Puerto Vallarta connection was mature. George had relationships with suppliers in Mexico who could provide marijuana in quantities measured not in kilos, but in tons. He had pilots, professional aviators who understood the mechanics of low-altitude flying, radar avoidance, and the art of disappearing into the visual noise of weekend air traffic over the Gulf Coast. He had ground crews who handled the offloading at remote landing strips, and the subsequent distribution networks that moved product north and east to the college towns and cities where demand was essentially limitless. The expansion into airborne smuggling was George's most significant innovation. It had been done before, but not at the scale he was operating. A single-engine plane could carry 600 to 800 pounds. A larger aircraft, the kind George and his associates eventually began using, could carry considerably more. The arithmetic compounded in his favor with each step up in capacity. And the demand was there. The demand was extraordinary. The 1970s were years in which marijuana had passed from the counterculture into the mainstream, not legally, not openly, but functionally. It was in the dormitories of every major university. It was at the dinner parties of young professionals in New York and Boston and Chicago. It was everywhere that the generation shaped by Vietnam and Woodstock had gathered, which was essentially everywhere. The market was not a niche. It was a continent. George Jung was well positioned to supply it. The Puerto Vallarta operation involved a geography that favored secrecy. The loading point near the coast was accessible only by sea, which meant no road traffic, no curious locals, no police patrols. The product was loaded onto small aircraft at night and flown north across the border in the pre-dawn hours when surveillance was thinnest. The landing strips, dry lake beds in California, private airstrips in Texas and New Mexico were pre-arranged, known only to the people who needed to know them. The money came in cash, enormous quantities of cash, duffel bags of it, cardboard boxes of it, the kind of money that you cannot simply deposit in a bank without raising questions for which there are no good answers. The kind of money that creates its own problems. Where do you keep it? How do you move it? How do you make it look like it came from somewhere respectable? George was not, at this stage, thinking carefully about those questions. He was thinking about the next flight, the next load, the next transaction. He was living inside the momentum of a business that was growing faster than his ability to manage the consequences. By the early 1970s, he was moving between California and Mexico and the northeastern United States with the fluency of a man who had learned to treat borders as inconveniences rather than barriers. He was spending money lavishly on houses, on cars, on the social lubrication of a life spent entertaining people whose goodwill he needed. He dressed well, he ate well. He was generous with the people around him in the way that people who have more money than they know what to do with are often generous, not from altruism exactly, but from the pleasure of being the person who can provide. He had a small circle of people he trusted absolutely. Among them was Frank Shee, a friend from back east who became a key figure in George's distribution network. There were others, men whose names surface and disappear in the court records and the journalistic accounts of the period, who formed the tissue of an organization that was never formalized, never chartered, never given a name, but which functioned with the kind of quiet efficiency that formal organizations spend millions trying to achieve. The operation ran, money flowed. Years passed, and then, in 1974, it ended. Not with a dramatic raid, not with a car chase or a gun battle, or any of the cinematic apparatus we associate with the collapse of criminal enterprises. It ended the way most things end, with someone talking. George was in Chicago with a load of marijuana, 660 pounds of it. He was staying at the Playboy Club, waiting for a connection who would take delivery of the product and handle the local distribution. The connection never showed. The connection had been arrested for heroin smuggling and had done what people in that situation often do. He had traded what he knew about others for a reduction in what was about to happen to him. He told the authorities about George Jung on the day George was arrested. He was not carrying a weapon. He was not running. He was at the Playboy Club, living well, waiting for a phone call that was never going to come. The agents who arrested him found 660 pounds of marijuana and a man who was genuinely unprepared for what was happening to him. He had been doing this for years. He had never been caught. The possibility of consequences had grown abstract with repetition, the way danger always grows abstract when it has been successfully avoided long enough. George argued with the judge at his sentencing. He argued earnestly. One imagines with some combination of genuine conviction and tactical hope that the law was unjust, that sending a man to prison for crossing an imaginary line with a bunch of plants made no sense, served no purpose, protected no one. The judge was unpersuaded. George was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution, Danbury, Connecticut. He was 32 years old. He thought he was going to prison. What he was actually doing was going to school, because Danbury was where he met Carlos Lehder, and Carlos Lehder was about to change everything. Imagine walking into a prison dormitory with a particular combination of anger and resignation that must accompany being sent away for what you genuinely believe was a victimless crime. Imagine finding your bunk assignment, dropping your gear, looking around at the men who will be your involuntary neighbors for the foreseeable future. Most of them are men you have nothing to learn from. Most of them are, in the vernacular of that world, mistakes, cautionary tales of one kind or another. And then imagine one of them turning to you, well-dressed in the way that some men remain well-dressed regardless of their circumstances. Articulate, measured, clearly intelligent, and asking you if you know anything about cocaine. His name, this man says, is Carlos Lehder. He is from Colombia, and he has an idea. Carlos Enrique Lehder Rivas was born on September 7, 1949, in Armenia, Colombia. To a German father and a Colombian mother, he was, by the time George Jung met him in the dormitory at Danbury, a young man of extraordinary intelligence and correspondingly extraordinary ambition. A man who had widely thought carefully about the mechanics of power and money, and arrived at the conclusion that the most important commodity in the world was not oil or steel or gold, but a white powder being produced in the mountains of South America and desired desperately and at almost any price by the affluent citizens of North America. He was 24 years old and already obsessed with this idea. George Jung's first impression of him, as he described in the PBS Frontline documentary, was of someone well-mannered and articulate, neat, the kind of man you considered yourself fortunate to share a cell with, because his temperament would make the time more bearable. They talked, as men in prisons always talk, first about small things, then about larger ones, and eventually, if the chemistry is right, about the things that matter most. Carlos asked George what he knew about cocaine. "Nothing," George said. "Tell me." And Carlos Lehder told him. It was not a sales pitch in the conventional sense. It was more like an education, a methodical presentation of an economic opportunity so significant that, once you understood the numbers, the only rational response was to ask when you could start. Lehder had been gathering information obsessively from everyone around him in Danbury, from money launderers, from other traffickers, from men who had worked in financial industries and knew how to move large sums across borders without triggering scrutiny. He had been constructing in his mind the complete architecture of what a properly organized cocaine operation would look like. He described it to George across days and weeks of conversation, in the intimate setting of a shared cell, with the thoroughness of a man who had thought about nothing else for years. The supply side, the processing, the transport, the margins, he laid it all out. This is where the story changes. In a cell in Danbury, Connecticut, in 1974, a man from Weymouth, Massachusetts, and a man from Armenia, Colombia, looked at each other across the mathematics of the cocaine trade and understood that neither of them would ever be the same. Did you know it sells for $60,000 a kilo in the United States? Carlos said, George didn't know that. How much does it cost in Colombia? $4,000 to $5,000? Carlos said. Let me slow down. Let me ask you to sit with that number. $4,000 to $5,000 in Colombia. $60,000 in the United States? On a single kilogram, a differential of $55,000 per kilo on a product that weighed next to nothing. That could be compressed, wrapped, sealed, hidden, and transported in the same small aircraft that George Jung already knew how to move through the sky without detection. George Jung was not a stupid man. He understood margins. He understood logistics. He understood the fundamental economics of moving a prohibited substance from a place of low price to a place of high price and capturing the difference. He had been doing exactly that with marijuana for years. He understood that the only thing standing between the supplier and the consumer was the risk and the infrastructure of transport, and that whoever controlled the transport controlled everything. Sitting in that Danbury cell, he began to understand what Carlos Lehder was describing. Not a crime, an industry. They were both released in 1975. Their sentences, in the context of what would come later, almost absurdly light. They walked out of Danbury with each other's phone numbers and a shared vision of what was possible. And they began, carefully and deliberately, to build it. Let me be precise about something here, because precision matters in a story that has been considerably mythologized. George Jung was a smuggler. He was brilliant at logistics and at building the American distribution networks, the buyers, the networks of trust, the channels through which product moved from arrival points to end users. Carlos Lehder was the architect of the supply side, the Colombian connections, the aviation infrastructure, the refueling network. They complemented each other almost perfectly. The first shipments were small, experimental. They used the techniques George already knew: small aircraft, private airstrips, men who could be trusted to move product and keep quiet. The initial cocaine loads were measured in kilos, not the tons that would come later. But the proof of concept was established quickly and confirmed what the numbers in the Danbury cell had suggested. The profit margins on cocaine were unlike anything the marijuana trade had ever offered. This is where Colombia enters the story. In the mid-1970s, Medellin was a city in transformation. The Colombian city of roughly 1 million people, situated in a mountain valley about 5,000 feet above sea level in the Andes, had long been an industrial center, textiles, manufacturing, the modest prosperity of a developing world city, making the most of its natural advantages. But it was also, by the mid-1970s, the emerging center of what would become the most powerful drug trafficking organization the world had ever seen. The men who would build the Medellin cartel were ambitious in the way that men from difficult circumstances are often ambitious, not content to accumulate slowly, not patient with the incremental, determined to make in 1 generation what others failed to make in 3 or 4. The Ochoa family, Jorge Luis Ochoa Vasquez, and his brothers Juan David and Fabio, were among the early architects of an organized cocaine supply network. They had the connections, the land, the money to invest, and the willingness to operate in the shadow of authority. And then there was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. George Jung would later claim, in interviews and in the book Blow, written by journalist Bruce Porter and published in 1993, that he met Pablo Escobar through Carlos Lehder's introduction at Escobar's ranch in Colombia. It should be noted that declassified de-intelligence assessments from the period describe Jung primarily as an independent American smuggler who operated alongside Lehder in the early phase of the cocaine trade, with his direct involvement with Escobar being difficult to verify from official records. What is certain is that Jung was connected to the supply network that Escobar and his associates were building, whether through direct contact or through Lehder's intermediary role. What is also certain is that Pablo Escobar himself, in the mid-1970s, was not yet the global symbol of narco-terror he would become. He was a young man from Medellin, born in 1949 like Lehder, who had grown up in the working-class barrios of the city, who had learned early that the formal economy offered the poor very little, and who had discovered in the cocaine trade both immense wealth and a peculiar kind of populist power. He was known in his neighborhood. He was building political connections. He had the charisma of a man who understood that power in Colombia came from many sources, money, certainly, but also loyalty, fear, and the complicated affection of communities that saw in him, however improbably, someone who represented their interests against a system that had long ignored them. He had also grown up in a country where the state had spent decades failing its citizens, so systematically that parallel power structures were not aberrations, but rational alternatives. Colombia in the 1970s was a country where the distance between the law on paper and the law in practice was measured in bodies, where judges received envelopes before they received cases, where the police could be purchased or intimidated with roughly equal efficiency. Into this environment, the cocaine trade did not arrive as a foreign intrusion. It arrived as an extension of existing conditions, more lucrative, more violent, more globally connected, but not fundamentally different in its relationship to official authority from the contraband, economies that had existed in the region for generations. The proposition that the Medellin network offered George Jung and Carlos Lehder was simple in its structure and staggering in its implications. Unlimited supply of cocaine. At Colombian prices, if the Americans could handle the transportation, they could handle the transportation. Carlos Lehder's great innovation, his singular contribution to what would become the cocaine explosion of the late 1970s and 1980s, was the use of the island of Norman's Cay in the Aussie, Bahamas as a refueling and transfer hub for cocaine, flights from Colombia to the United States. He began buying up property on Norman's Cay in 1978. He reportedly spent $4.5 million acquiring the island and transforming it into what it needed to be, a private fiefdom, invisible to authority, operating under rules of its own making. The island's existing residents were harassed and threatened until they left. The Bahamian government, whose cooperation was reportedly secured through bribes paid to Prime Minister Lyndon Pindling, looked the other way. By 1979, Norman's Cay was effectively under Carlos Lehder's personal control. What he built there was extraordinary in its audacity. A 3,300-foot runway, capable of handling fully loaded aircraft. Radar systems to monitor approaching traffic. A perimeter guarded by armed men and Doberman attack dogs. The island's hotel and houses were converted into operational facilities, staging areas for product, accommodations for pilots and crews, the infrastructure of a logistics operation running around the clock. The method worked like this. Cocaine was produced in Colombia, packaged and flown north. The aircraft, small, fast, capable of low-altitude flight that made radar detection difficult, stopped at Norman's Cay for fuel, maintenance, and crew rest. Then they flew north across the Florida Straits, dropping down to wave height to slip under the radar coverage, before turning along the coast and landing at prearranged strips in Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas. The loads were 300 kilos per flight, sometimes more, at a profit of $15,000 per kilo, buying at Colombian prices, selling at American ones. Accounting for logistics costs, a single flight generated approximately $4.5 million in profit. Per flight, running multiple flights per week. Multiply that out. Take a moment and actually do the arithmetic. In the PBS Frontline documentary, one associate described Norman's Cay with a bluntness that captures something essential about what the island had become. Norman's Cay was a playground, and there we partied, and it was a Sodom and Gomorrah. Drugs, sex, no police. You made the rules. And it was fun. For the people at the center of it, it was fun. This matters, because it explains how otherwise intelligent people participated in something whose human costs were catastrophic. The American cocaine explosion of the late 1970s did not feel, To the people supplying it, like a disaster, it felt like capitalism. It felt like identifying a need and filling it. It felt like the free market operating at maximum efficiency in a space that the official market had abandoned. George Jung and Carlos Lehder were not standing in the shadows of Norman's Cay, feeling guilty about what they were doing. They were feeling wealthy. They were feeling powerful. They were feeling that particular sensation, addictive in its own way, as compelling as any substance, of being the people who made things happen, of being the essential nodes through which enormous quantities of money and product and consequence flowed every single week. It wasn't fun in spite of the destruction it was causing. It was fun in a bubble that insulated them from the destruction entirely. Norman's Cay existed in a parallel world, gorgeous, lawless, intoxicated, running on the adrenaline of enormous money and the particular madness of operating entirely outside the constraints that governed everyone else's lives. By the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, the network that George Jung helped build, his American contacts, his distribution channels, the networks of buyers and transporters and middlemen stretching from the southeast up the eastern seaboard and into the cities, was handling, by federal prosecution estimates, approximately 85% of all cocaine entering the United States. 85%. The American cocaine explosion of the 1980s, the powder that dusted the mirror on every bathroom counter, at every party in Manhattan and Los Angeles and Chicago, the fuel of the decade's particular energetic excess, the substance that would eventually reveal itself as catastrophically destructive to millions of lives, flowed through pipelines that George Jung and Carlos Lehder had built. George would later say, "I went from a small-town pot dealer to becoming the largest importer of cocaine in United States history." He said it flatly, without particular pride, without particular shame, the way a man states a fact that has ceased to surprise him. What does it do to a person to have that kind of money, that kind of reach, that kind of power over something that millions of people want desperately? I have thought about this question for a long time. I think the answer is, it does exactly what you would expect it to do. It inflates, it insulates, it creates a feedback loop in which success confirms the decisions that led to it, and the decisions that led to success begin to feel not just justified, but inevitable, as though the universe itself had designed this outcome, as though the man at the center of it was fulfilling some preordained role, rather than making choices that were destroying lives at a scale he could not see from where he stood. The money was real. The cocaine was real. The buyers were real, and they were everywhere. The consequences were also real, but those were happening to other people, in other cities, in other worlds, and for a time, for a significant, astonishing, terrible time, the world George Jung inhabited refused to let those other worlds in. At his peak, by his own estimate, George Jung had made, and been exposed to making, roughly $100 million. $100 million in 1980s dollars. Let that sit with you, not the abstract number, but the physical reality of it, the houses, the boats, the cars, the restaurants, the chartered flights, the lifestyle that money of that magnitude purchases, the particular kind of weightlessness that comes from never having to think about cost, from being able to reach for anything and know that the bill will be handled, that the resources are essentially without limit, that the world will accommodate whatever you decide you want from it today. George Jung, the boy from Weymouth, whose father had bent his back for years and barely kept the lights on, was living like a king. He had houses, he had cars. He had the social life of a man who was, by his own description, a coke star, Not a rock star or a movie star, but the equivalent. In the underground economy of the cocaine trade, of someone at the absolute apex of an industry that was generating more money than any single legitimate business in American history at the time. I was a guy who had a lot of money and unlimited access to cocaine, he would say. And even if I looked like Bela Lugosi, I still had the most beautiful women on the planet. He did not look like Bela Lugosi. Around this time, George met Mirtha. Mirtha was Colombian, striking, intelligent, and deeply embedded in the same world George inhabited. Their relationship was, from the beginning, constructed on an unstable foundation. They were both using cocaine. They were both living at the center of an operation that demanded constant alertness and simultaneously provided every conceivable means of numbing that alertness. They moved through the world in the particular way that very wealthy people in illicit industries move, with style and paranoia, and the underlying knowledge that nothing around them was entirely real. They married in 1978. Christina Sunshine Jung was born, a daughter, his daughter. Let me slow down here, because this is, in a quiet and devastating way, the center of everything. Not the cocaine, not the money, not the Medellin Cartel, or Norman's Cay, or the 85% statistic that federal prosecutors would want. They deploy against him. The center of the story of George Jung, the thing that makes it more than just a crime narrative, the thing that elevates it into something genuinely tragic, is his daughter, Christina Sunshine Jung. The name alone tells you something. Sunshine. A father naming his child with a word that means warmth and light, and the thing that grows when darkness retreats. A man who had lived for years in the shadows, choosing that word for the most important thing in his life. It is not a small detail. Sunshine. George loved her, by all accounts, unreservedly and genuinely. She was the one thing in a life full of artificial pleasures that was unambiguously real. And yet, and this is the unbearable paradox at the heart of this story, the very life that he was living to provide for her, the choices he was making, that he told himself were in service of her future, were simultaneously making it impossible for him to be the father she needed. He was using more cocaine, not just moving it, but consuming it. This is a transition that almost everyone in the cocaine trade made eventually, and it was as predictable as it was devastating. The drug that you transport, that you handle, that you are surrounded by daily, that you see consumed by everyone around you as a marker of wealth and status. You begin to use it, not because you are weak necessarily, but because it is everywhere, and the culture of the trade normalized it completely. And cocaine, of course, does not care about your insider status. It does not care that you are the man who built the network. It dismantles the capacity for judgment with the same indifference it applies to everyone. It inflates confidence while steadily undermining the judgment that would make that confidence warranted. It creates the sensation of control while eroding the actual ability to exercise it. George Jung was using cocaine heavily by the early 1980s. In the way that people use it, when it is free and constant and woven into the texture of every day, the relationship with Mirtha was fracturing. The money was real. The lifestyle was lavish. But something in the household was corrosive and getting worse. Paranoia, mistrust, the specific toxicity that cocaine inflicts on intimate relationships, in which the drug simultaneously inflates confidence and hollows out empathy, leaving behind people who are louder and more certain and less capable of hearing anything outside themselves. And the operation itself was changing. The cocaine trade of the early 1980s was not the handshake business that the marijuana trade had been. The money was different, the scale was different, and the men involved were different. Carlos Lehder was becoming erratic, the confident, analytical man who had laid out the mathematics of the cocaine trade in a Danbury cell was evolving into something harder to navigate. A man whose success had amplified certain qualities that were not, upon amplification, attractive. He was developing a political ideology that was as unstable as it was grandiose. A neo-Nazi nationalism grafted onto a kind of Latin populism that made no coherent sense, but that he advanced with increasing intensity. He founded a political party in Colombia, the National Latin Movement. He gave public speeches. He positioned himself impossibly. As a political figure, the Medellin cartel was also growing in ways that made George increasingly uncomfortable. The violence that Pablo Escobar was willing to deploy against judges, against politicians, against journalists, against anyone who threatened the operation's interests, was of a different order than anything the marijuana trade had ever involved. Escobar had ordered bombings. He had ordered assassinations. He had made it clear that the tools available to him included weapons that George Jung had never wanted to be anywhere near. "I never killed anyone," George would say repeatedly across the years. "I never hurt anyone." And this claim deserves to be examined carefully, not to condemn him simply, not to absolve him simply, but to look at it honestly. He did not personally kill anyone. He did not order violence. He was not, by temperament or inclination, a violent man. These things appear to be true, but the operation he helped build was not nonviolent. The men at the top of the supply chain he served were responsible for murders, dozens, then hundreds, and the product he transported destroyed lives at a scale that has no direct equivalent in the marijuana trade that preceded it. These things are also true. The contradiction between these two sets of truths is where the moral complexity of George Jung's life actually lives. The cracks were spreading. In the empire, in the marriage, in the man himself. And then the government arrived. The D had been watching. This is not a surprise. In retrospect, what is surprising is how long it took. The Medellin cartel's operations had been generating intelligence for years. The Norman's K hub had been, ultimately, shut down not by brilliant detective work, but by the sheer impossibility of concealing what an entire island, openly controlled by a Colombian drug lord, was doing. Its shutdown in 1982 was a logistical blow, but the product kept flowing through new routes, new Caribbean transit points, new methods. The DEA's investigation into the cartel was a massive enterprise that consumed enormous resources across multiple agencies and multiple years. The problem was not lack of evidence. Evidence was eventually abundant, but the complexity of the network, the jurisdictions involved, and the corruption in certain Caribbean governments that provided shelter. In America, the investigation worked more efficiently. Money could be followed, informants could be developed, wiretaps and surveillance could be deployed, and the informants, eventually, were everywhere. In a network built on personal trust, the surest sign of compromise was when people inside it began calculating their own survival against the risk of continued loyalty. That calculation is not romantic. It is mathematics, and in 1987, it reached George Jung. George's personal life was also in freefall. His marriage to Mirtha had devolved into something painful and complicated, marked by her own cocaine use, by the mutual suspicion of two people who had built their lives together on a foundation that was now showing every crack. They had a daughter, Christina, still young, still mostly insulated from what was happening around her, and for her sake, and possibly for other reasons, the marriage was maintained beyond the point when it should have ended. In 1987, George Jung was arrested. The 1987 arrest found George in a position he had been in before, but not at this level of legal jeopardy. The governance case against him was substantial. His options were limited, and around him, the people who had been his partners and associates were themselves making calculations about cooperation and self-preservation that were not necessarily sympathetic to his interests. Murtha cooperated with authorities. Let me say that plainly, without the softening language that sometimes attaches to this fact. Murtha Jung, his wife, the mother of his daughter, provided information to federal investigators. The precise scope and impact of her cooperation is difficult to establish from public records. But what is clear is that the dissolution of George's marriage and his legal situation were not separate events. They were intertwined in ways that neither party could fully control. George was convicted. He was looking at serious time. In the late 1980s, as George Jung was navigating the consequences of his 1987 arrest, attempting to reduce his sentence, attempting to manage the fallout of a life coming apart at every seam, Carlos Lehder was extradited to the United States. He became, in 1987, the first high-level Colombian drug trafficker to be extradited to America for prosecution. He was tried in Jacksonville, Florida, and in 1988 was convicted on 11 counts and sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 135 years. George testified against him. This is a fact that carries tremendous moral and practical weight, and it should be stated plainly rather than buried in the surrounding narrative. George Jung, who had built the American distribution network that made the Medellin cartel's cocaine trade possible, testified against his partner of more than a decade in exchange for a reduction in his own sentence. His cooperation contributed to one of the most significant drug trafficking convictions in American history. Whether this was justice or simply the mechanics of a legal system that trades information for leniency, or something more complex than either of those framings, I leave that to your own judgment. What I can tell you is that in 1994, 9 years after his first cocaine conviction, George Jung was arrested again. He was caught in Topeka, Kansas, with approximately 1,754 pounds of cocaine, roughly 796 kilograms. A former associate named Derek Foriel, who had once been part of the operation and had since turned government informant, had led the D directly to him, the man who had once moved hundreds of kilos per flight, who had once sat at the center of a network handling the bulk of America's cocaine supply, was arrested with nearly a ton of product in a Midwestern city that bore no particular relationship to the glory years of the operation. He was sentenced to 60 years in federal prison. 60 years. He was 52 years old. He would later reflect on this sentence with a kind of dark clarity. I went in with Pablo Escobar. I came out and he was dead. Escobar had been killed by Colombian security forces on December 2, 1993, hunted down on a Medellin rooftop the day after his 44th birthday. The empire they had collectively helped build had long since consumed its builders. George Jung's sentence was eventually reduced, again through cooperation, again through the painful arithmetic of trading information for years, to approximately 20 years. He was incarcerated at multiple federal facilities over the following 2 decades. Otisville Federal Prison in New York, Federal Correctional Institution Fort Dix in New Jersey, Federal Correctional Institution La Tuna in Anthony, Texas. In prison, he was a figure of some notoriety. He had always been a storyteller. It was part of what made him effective in the world outside. The ability to make himself interesting, to make the transaction feel personal, to make the people around him feel like they were part of something larger than themselves. In prison, the storytelling continued. He was interviewed. He was sought out by journalists and documentary filmmakers. He gave accounts of his life with a self-awareness that was sometimes genuine and sometimes clearly shaped by the desire to maintain a certain image. Prison changes a man differently, depending on what the man was before he entered. For someone who had operated for decades in near total personal freedom, his own schedule, his own geography, his own rules, his own horizon, the institution was a particular kind of diminishment. Not only the violence or the deprivation, though those existed. The specific weight of confinement for a man like George was the absence of agency, the inability to decide where to be, what to do, when to eat, when to sleep, when to be permitted to look at the sky. The years compounded quietly. The 1990s became the 2000s became the 2010s. The world outside transformed while he sat still. He wrote letters to Christina. He called when he could. He made promises. She had grown up without him, mostly without him. Her childhood had been shaped by the absence at its center, by the father who was present in stories and in legal documents, and in the mythology of the cocaine trade, but who was not present at school plays or dinners or the ordinary occasions of a life. She had been raised in ways that exposed her to her own difficulties with substances. The damage that radiates from a destroyed family does not respect generations. The letters continued, the calls continued, the promises continued, and then, on June 2nd, 2014, after nearly 20 years, George Jung walked out of Federal Correctional Institution Fort Dix. He was 71 years old. The world had changed. Everything had changed in 2001. Ted Dem directed a film called Blow. Johnny Depp played George Jung. Penelope Cruz played Mirtha. The film was based largely on Bruce Porter's 1993 book of the same name, which itself drew heavily on George Jung's own account of his life. It was, by Hollywood standards, a sophisticated attempt to tell a morally complex story, not an action film, not a pure celebration of criminal excess, but something that aspired to the literary register of a tragedy. The film was not a massive box office success. It performed modestly, but over the years since its release, it has accumulated something more durable than opening weekend receipts, a cultural presence, a reputation as a serious piece of crime drama, the particular longevity of films that people discover on late nights and recommend to friends and return to when they want to feel the weight of a certain kind of story. Johnny Depp's performance was, by most measures, excellent. He gave George Jung a particular quality, a wistfulness, a fundamental warmth undermined by self-destruction, the portrait of a man who genuinely loved the people he kept abandoning. The film's emotional through line was the father-daughter relationship, the scenes between George and young Christina that gave the story its moral stakes, something to lose that was worth the losing, something that made the tragedy feel real rather than merely dramatic. What did the film get right? It got the arc right. The marijuana years in California, the move to cocaine, the Danbury meeting with Carlos Lehder, the staggering wealth, the inevitable collapse. The broad structure of the story was accurately rendered. It captured something true about the intoxication of sudden wealth for someone who grew up without it. It captured something true about the way paranoia grows as an operation scales. It captured, in its quieter moments, the hollowness at the center of a life constructed entirely around the accumulation of money and the avoidance of consequences. Penelope Cruz as Mirtha brought a dimension to the character that went beyond simple villain, a woman who was herself caught in the same current that had swept George, who had her own hungers and her own vulnerabilities, and who was not. Simply a supporting figure in someone else's story, but a person whose choices were her own and whose cooperation with federal authorities was, from her own perspective, a rational response to an impossible situation. The film never quite gave her enough room, but the best moments between her character and Depp's gave the viewer a sense of the original wreckage of that marriage. What did it simplify or get wrong? The film compresses and dramatizes in the ways that films must. The timeline is adjusted. Certain characters are composited or invented for narrative convenience. The relationship with the Medellin cartel is depicted with a directness and a personal vividness that may exceed what the verified historical record supports. The meeting with Pablo Escobar, depicted in the film as a significant scene, exists in the realm of George's own account, compelling and possibly true, but not independently verifiable in the way that the Danbury meeting with Lehder, for example, is verifiable. The film also, despite its best intentions, could not entirely escape the gravitational pull of glamorization. The cars, the clothes, the houses, the easy money, even when presented with a knowing irony, even when surrounded by the narrative's insistence on eventual consequences. There is something in the visual grammar of cinema that makes wealth look appealing and danger look exciting. This is not a criticism unique to Blow. It is the fundamental tension of any film that tries to depict criminal excess while also condemning it. George Jung saw the film. He expressed, in various interviews over the years, a complicated response to it. He appreciated the attention. He appreciated Depp's portrayal, the warmth in it, the specificity, the way Depp found the human being beneath the criminal biography and rendered him as someone worth caring about. He was moved by the focus on his relationship with Christina. That particular wound, the failure of fatherhood inside the frame of criminal success, was the one that cut most deeply. And seeing it rendered on screen with genuine emotional intelligence meant something to him. He also understood, perhaps better than anyone, the gap between the film and the reality. The film was a story about him. His actual life was something the camera couldn't quite get at. The specific texture of 20 years in federal prison, the letters that went unanswered, the phone calls that ended in silence, the daily grinding reality of having been worth $100 million and then finding yourself in a concrete room, waiting to be someone's bunk mate again. The film asked audiences to feel something about George Jung. Most of them did, whether that feeling was the right feeling, whether the complicated empathy the film generated was a just response to the complicated truth of the man's life is a question that matters more than it might initially appear. Because the film made George Jung famous, it made him a figure in the culture. And cultural fame for a man in prison is a strange and largely useless form of currency. He couldn't spend it. It couldn't visit. It didn't keep the lights on, or reduce the sentence, or bring Christina to the phone. What it could do, and what it did, was make him a story that people told each other, a story that made him interesting rather than simply guilty, whether that was justice or something else entirely. I honestly cannot say. On June 2nd, 2014, a man walked out of a federal correctional facility in New Jersey. He was 71 years old. He had been inside for nearly 20 years. He had entered that system in 1994, when Bill Clinton was president, when the internet was a novelty, when cell phones were the size of bricks, and belonged mostly to people who could afford things that only very wealthy people owned. He walked out in 2014 into a world that had been remade while he was absent from it. He walked out to find smartphones and social media in a country in which marijuana, the substance for which he had first been imprisoned 40 years earlier, was in the process of being legalized in state after state. He walked out into a country that had spent the decades since his prime doing enormous damage to itself and to others in the name of a war on drugs that had not won the war, had not reduced the drugs, had not made communities safer or families more intact, or the misery of addiction more manageable. He walked out into a country that had turned him into a movie character. What do you do with that? What do you do when you are 71 years old? When your body carries the marks of decades of incarceration and the residual damage of years of cocaine use, and the accumulated weight of everything you chose and everything you lost, and you walk into a world that knows your face from a Johnny Depp film? George tried to rebuild. He made appearances. He sold merchandise. It was a brief, somewhat melancholy period in which he leaned into his notoriety. The Boston George brand, the autographs, the small economy of being a famous criminal who was no longer actively criminal and was therefore safe to be admired at a distance. He contributed to a novel. He gave interviews in 2016. He violated the conditions of his federal supervision and was jailed again. He was released from a halfway house in 2017. The pattern of his late life had a quality of inevitability to it, not because he was irredeemable, but because the habits of a lifetime, the patterns of thinking and choosing that had carried him from Weymouth to Danbury, to Columbia, to Norman's Cay, to federal prison, and back again, are not the kind of habits that dissolve simply because a door opens. And Christina, always Christina, the relationship between George Jung and his daughter is the true emotional core of this story. Not the cocaine, not the cartel, not the money or the glamour or the legal architecture of his multiple convictions, but this, a father and daughter whose relationship was built in absence and sustained through letters and phone calls, and the particular kind of love that exists between people who are connected by blood and separated by choices that cannot be undone. Christina Sunshine Jung grew up largely without her father. She had her own struggles, her own encounters with the gravitational pull of substances, her own navigation of a life lived in the shadow of a famous father's famous crimes. She built a life. She married. She had a daughter of her own, Athena Karan. When George was released in 2014, he and Christina worked, reportedly, at Reconnection. The details of their late relationship are not fully public. Some things should not be fully public, even in a story told with as much transparency as this one attempts. What we know is that they spoke, that they saw each other, that the man who had been absent for most of her childhood was finally, in the last years of his life, present in some form. The losses in this family continued to accumulate in ways that the public record does not fully capture. Private griefs, compounding over years, the kind of damage that radiates outward from a destroyed family and does not respect generations. The losses in this story accumulate without mercy. George Jung was by then in serious physical decline, liver failure, kidney failure, the slow dismantling of the body that eventually arrives for everyone, and arrives for some people with particular urgency. He was receiving hospice care. He returned to Weymouth, to the town where it had all started, to the place where Frederick Jung had worked his honest and insufficient life, to the shores where a boy had once stood and dreamed of something larger than what the town could offer. On May 5, 2021, George Jacob Jung died at his home in Weymouth, Massachusetts. He was 78 years old. In the end, he died in the same town where he was born. He had traveled to the Caribbean and to Colombia and to the peaks and depths of the American criminal underworld and back again. And the final coordinate on his map was the same as the first one. Weymouth, where Christina Jung continues her life, where she navigates, as best she can, the complicated inheritance her father left her, not money, not any of the 100 million that had, dissolved in legal fees and government seizure and the general entropy of a life spent outside the law, but the inheritance of a name, a story, and the specific and irreducible difficulty of this, being the daughter of a famous man who is absent for the years that mattered most. She is alive. She is continuing that, in its own quiet way, is something we need to stop here. We need to stop and do something that the movie did not do enough of, and that this story, told as it is with a certain cinematic gravity, is in constant danger of failing to do properly. We need to look honestly and without flinching at the human cost of what George Jung helped build. The cocaine that passed through the networks he helped construct did not disappear into the air. It arrived. It arrived in American cities, in American living rooms, and American veins. It arrived in the late 1970s and the 1980s at precisely the moment when the social fabric of many urban communities in America was already under extraordinary stress, when manufacturing jobs were leaving, when the tax base of cities was eroding, when the safety nets were being cut and the schools were underfunded, and the future, for certain communities, was being systematically foreclosed. Into that context, cocaine arrived, and then crack cocaine arrived. This is important to understand clearly. George Jung moved powder cocaine, the drug in its more expensive form, the drug that was consumed primarily by people who could afford it, by the affluent users of Manhattan and Los Angeles, in the suburban parties where professionals lined up mirrors and bathrooms at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. George moved the commodity at the wholesale level. He was not responsible for its transformation into crack cocaine, which was a separate development, an innovation in the chemistry of distribution that allowed the same basic drug to be consumed more cheaply and more addictively. But they are connected. The powder cocaine that flooded America in the early 1980s created the market, infrastructure, the distribution networks, the dealer relationships, the demand, into which crack cocaine, when it emerged around 1984 and 1985, could be inserted almost immediately. The pipeline that George helped build carried the supply that preceded the devastation. These are not abstractions. These are human beings. Consider what the crack cocaine epidemic actually looked like at street level. In cities like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Detroit, Los Angeles, and Chicago, the arrival of crack transformed neighborhoods with a speed and thoroughness that no previous substance had managed. A drug that could be purchased for as little as $5 compared to the $100 or more that a gram of powder cocaine cost meant that addiction was suddenly accessible to people who had never been in the cocaine market before. The economy of crack dealing was extraordinarily violent because the margins at street level were thin enough that territory was worth protecting with weapons, because disputes could not be adjudicated by anything but force, because the entire infrastructure existed outside the law and therefore outside any mechanism of peaceful resolution. Between 1984 and 1990, homicide rates in American cities rose dramatically. The connection to the crack epidemic was not incidental. It was structural, and the communities where this violence was most concentrated were already the communities that had been most systematically disadvantaged by decades of disinvestment, redlining, and the departure of the manufacturing jobs that had once provided stable working-class livelihoods. The crack cocaine crisis also produced a legislative response that compounded the original harm. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 established sentencing guidelines that imposed dramatically harsher penalties for crack cocaine offenses than for powder cocaine offenses, a disparity of 100 to 1 that meant someone convicted of possessing 5 grams of crack, received the same mandatory minimum sentence as someone convicted of possessing 500 grams of powder cocaine. Because crack use was more prevalent in black communities and powder cocaine more prevalent in white ones, the practical effect of these laws was a mass incarceration crisis that was disproportionate in its racial application by any objective measure. The children who grew up in neighborhoods hollowed out by this combination of epidemic and incarceration carry those formative years inside them still. In Colombia, the violence of the Medellin cartel, the violence that protected and enforced the cocaine trade that George Jung's American networks depended upon, was categorical and horrific. Pablo Escobar and the men around him ordered the murders of judges who refused to defer to them, of journalists who wrote about them, of politicians who stood against them, of civilians who were simply in the wrong place when the cartel's war was prosecuted. Presidential candidates were assassinated. A civilian airliner was blown out of the sky. A car bomb in Medellin killed 73 people. The police officers, the soldiers, the prosecutors. The ordinary Colombians who tried to do their jobs in the shadow of a criminal organization with more money and weapons than the state, paid with their lives in numbers that have no easy parallel in the history of peacetime violence. George Jung said he never killed anyone. He said he never hurt anyone. Imagine saying that to a judge in Medellin whose family received threats. Imagine saying it to the mother of a 19-year-old who became addicted to crack cocaine in 1986 in a neighborhood in Baltimore. Imagine saying it to the children who grew up without fathers, without mothers, without the basic structures of functional family life, because the addiction that the cocaine trade enabled had consumed the people who were supposed to be there. George Jung did not pull any triggers. He did not mix any crack. He did not design the sentencing laws, or build the failed rehabilitation systems, or make any of the 100 other decisions that turned a drug epidemic into a societal catastrophe. These are also true things, but the infrastructure he helped construct was the necessary precondition for all of it. His own family was not spared. His daughter grew up without him. The destruction that radiated from the decisions he made touched, in the end, everyone he claimed to love. This story cannot be told honestly without this weight. It cannot be told as tragedy without acknowledging whose tragedy it actually was. The thousands of people who died addicted, the communities that were dismantled, the Colombian dead, the American dead, the families on every side of every border, in every country that the cocaine trade passed through, who lost people they loved to violence and addiction and incarceration, and the 1,000 quieter forms of devastation that accompany all of it. They deserve to be in this story. They deserve more than a section, but at least a section. There is a question I keep returning to, the longer I sit with this story. What made George Jung different from the hundreds of other men who moved drugs through the 1970s and 1980s, and whose names we do not know, and whose stories were never turned into films? The honest answer is not much in terms of character or moral constitution. There were other smart men. There were other well-connected men. There were other men with the ability to charm and organize and think logistically at scale. What made George Jung different was a combination of timing, being in California when the marijuana trade was expanding, being in Danbury when Carlos Lehder happened to be there, being positioned to take advantage of the Colombian supply chain before it had found its reliable American distribution network, and the specific accident of having his story told by a journalist and then by a filmmaker. The crime was the crime. A story made it a story. And stories are how we process things that are otherwise too large or too complex to hold directly. We need the individual case, the one person, the face, the name, to make comprehensible the systemic reality that the individual case is always only a fraction of. George Jung is comprehensible in a way that the American cocaine epidemic is not. We can hold George in our minds. We cannot hold simultaneously, with equal weight, the thousands of individual lives the epidemic consumed. What does this story mean? I ask that question genuinely, without a prepackaged answer. The longer I spend with this material, the more convinced I am that the two obvious interpretive traps, the one that turns George Jung into a hero, and the one that turns him into a simple villain, are both wrong and both easy, and both failures of the kind of moral attention that a story like this requires. The glorification trap is visible and well documented. It is the trap that the film Blow partially fell into, despite its better intentions. It is the trap of the merchandise and the social media tributes and the romanticized image of the American outlaw who played by his own rules and paid the price. It flatters the part of us that wants to believe the rules are unjust and the rebel who breaks them is somehow telling a deeper truth. There is a reason this mythology endures, and it is not because we are all secret criminals. It is because the suspicion that the rules are made by and for the powerful, that the system is not neutral, that the official channels do not offer equal opportunity to everyone who enters them. This suspicion is not simply wrong. George Jung's story feels like a validation of that suspicion, which is part of why it resonates. But the validation comes at an enormous price that the glorification trap wants you to ignore. The condemnation trap, which is equally useless, simplifies him in the opposite direction. The simple moral calculation. He was a drug dealer. He ruined lives. He deserves what he got. End of story. This version of the story is also too easy, and not because it's inaccurate. The parts of it that are true are genuinely true. But it evacuates the story of human complexity. It turns George Jung into an abstraction, a symbol of criminal excess, a cautionary tale, a figure in a public service announcement. It also, in its own way, avoids the hardest questions, because the hardest questions are not about whether what he did was wrong. It was wrong. The hard questions are about why. Why does a story like this happen? Why does a boy from a working-class town in Massachusetts, intelligent and charming, and not without genuine qualities, end up helping to flood his country with a substance that destroys lives? What is it about the particular combination of poverty anxiety and personal ambition and cultural moment that produces a George Jung? And what does it say about the country that the product he moved was wanted by so many people that it made him one of the wealthiest private individuals in the United States for a time? There is something here about the American dream that deserves serious attention. The story of George Jung is, in one reading, the American dream told honestly, the version that the official mythology doesn't acknowledge. It is the story of a man who grew up watching the system fail his father, who decided that the rules of the game were rigged, and who found a market so enormous and so lucrative that he became staggeringly rich in it. He wanted what the dream promised. He pursued it with genuine ingenuity and genuine effort and genuine risk. He got it, and it was built on the bodies of people he never met. The American dream, as an ideology, tends to focus on the individual and his journey. It tends not to look at the externalities, at the people who didn't win, at the communities that bore the cost of someone else's extraordinary success, at the structural conditions that make certain kinds of winning look heroic only because we've agreed to ignore. Who pays for the celebration? George Jung did not invent cocaine. He did not invent addiction. He did not invent inequality or working-class anger or the market dynamics that made the cocaine trade. so explosively profitable. He did not invent the American desire for intoxication, which is old and various and cannot be laid at anyone's door in particular. He did not invent the Colombian poverty that made the trade so attractive to men like Escobar, or the political failures that allowed a cartel to operate more powerfully than the state for nearly 2 decades. He found all of these things already in motion and inserted himself into them as a crucial moving part. But insertion is not neutrality. Participation is not innocence. Was he exceptional? Unquestionably, the scale of what he accomplished in purely logistical, entrepreneurial terms is genuinely remarkable. The agents who eventually prosecuted him were not wrong to describe him as one of the most significant drug traffickers in American history. He had capabilities, organizational, interpersonal, logistical, that in another context and another century might have built something very different. I never killed anyone. I never hurt anyone, he insisted. The truth, as always, is more complicated than either trap allows. He did not kill anyone directly. He hurt people, many people, an unknowable number of people, indirectly and at a scale that his individual culpability cannot fully account for and cannot be entirely excused. He was one node in a system, a crucial node, but a node, not a system. The war on drugs, the policy framework within which his entire criminal career unfolded, has been, by virtually every measure of empirical assessment, a failure. It has not reduced drug use. It has not reduced drug trafficking. It has instead produced mass incarceration, has devastated communities with disproportionate enforcement, has spent trillions of dollars and produced outcomes measurably worse than the alternative approaches taken by countries that treat addiction as a public health problem rather than a criminal justice one. George Jung's 60-year sentence was the war on drugs at its most literal. It did not make anyone safer. It did not undo anything he had done. It consumed 20 years of the remaining life of a 70-year-old man. Whether you believe justice was served, I leave to your own conscience. What I believe is this: the story of George Jung is a story about the distance between what America tells itself and what America actually does. It is a story about a man who believed with his whole being that the rules were designed for other people, and who spent a life paying the price for being right about that in all the wrong ways. Come with me to Weymouth. It is a gray day. It is almost always a gray day in Weymouth in November. The kind of gray that sits low on the water and muffles the world. The kind of gray that makes the town feel old in a way that is not unpleasant, just honest. Just the honest acknowledgement that winter is coming, that things change slowly here, that the past presses close. The town does not announce its connection to George Jung. There is no plaque, no memorial, no acknowledgement in the public spaces of the town that one of its sons remade the American drug landscape in the 1970s and 1980s and died here. Finally, after a long voyage through the worst of what the country he helped intoxicate had to offer, the town continues as it continued before he left it, quietly, stubbornly, with the particular pride of a working-class community that does not require acknowledgement from anyone. Frederick Jung worked here. He bent his back here. He tried his best here, and the ledger didn't balance. And his son watched it happen and drew the wrong conclusion and set off toward a horizon that turned out to be a mirage. Walk down to the water, stand at the edge of the harbor, and listen to what the ocean sounds like in November. The particular cold percussion of waves against rock, the cry of gulls over gray water, the distant sound of a boat engine somewhere in the channel. This is what George Jung was born to. This is the sensory landscape of his earliest consciousness. Before California, before Carlos Lehder, before Colombia and cocaine, and $100 million that came and went and left nothing permanent behind. This is where he started. This is where he ended. Between those 2 points, there are people, let me say their names, in no particular order of importance. Frederick Jung, Herman Jung, Richard Bareil, called Tuna, Barbara Buckley, Frank Shee, Derek Foriel, Carlos Enrique Lehder Rivas, the men of the meddling cartel, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, the pilots, the ground crews, the distributors, the buyers, the addicts, the people who tried to stop it, the D agents, the prosecutors, the Colombian judges and police officers and civilians who paid with their lives for standing against the tide. Mirtha Jung, Christina Sunshine Jung. These are the people in this story. Remember them, not with romance, not with condemnation, but with the full, complicated human attention every story deserves. Remember that every name on this list belongs to a person who ate and slept and had fears and wanted things and existed in a specific moment in time with specific choices available to them. Some of them made choices that destroyed others. Some of them had choices made for them. Some of them tried to be good and failed. Some of them tried to be good and succeeded in ways that this story, focused as it necessarily is on the dramatic, cannot fully represent. The wind off Weymouth Harbor in November is cold and smells of salt and distance. It is the same wind that was blowing on August 6, 1942, when a boy was born and given a name and started accumulating the experiences that would make him who he was. The wind does not judge. The wind just blows. And the story it carries, the whole long, strange American story of money and desire and consequence and loss, keeps moving, keeps expanding, keeps finding new people to inhabit and new choices to present and new reckonings to deliver. We are still in it. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you, truly. I mean that in the most literal possible way. This kind of storytelling, slow, serious, unwilling to cut the difficult parts, requires a particular kind of attention that is not always easy to give. You stayed with it. You sat with the weight of it. You let the complications in without demanding a clean resolution that the facts cannot honestly provide. That matters not just to me, to the stories themselves, to the people whose lives these stories are made of. The George Jung story is one that people have told many ways, as crime drama, as cautionary tale, as nostalgia trip, as character study. I have tried to tell it as honestly as I know how, with the acknowledgement that honesty in this context requires holding multiple truths simultaneously, that he was brilliant and destructive, that he was a loving father and a catastrophically absent one, that he was a victim of certain structural realities and the perpetrator of genuine harm, that his story is American in ways that cut deeper than any simple moral can reach. There are more stories waiting, stories told with the same commitment to honesty and complexity and the refusal of easy answers. Stories that will make you sit up a little straighter and feel a little more awake to the world and the people in it. If you want to be there for those stories, subscribe right now. The button is right there. It costs you nothing, and it means more than I can easily explain. And then tell me something. In the comments below, just type Austin George. Let me know you are here. Let me know this story reached you wherever you are, at whatever hour you are watching this, in whatever mood and circumstance brought you here tonight. George Jung died in May 2021 in a hospice bed in Weymouth, with liver and kidney failure, completing a work that decades of extraordinary living had begun. He was 78 years old. He had been the largest importer of cocaine in United States history. He had spent most of his adult life in federal prison. He had a daughter he loved and largely failed. He had made and lost $100 million. He had been played by Johnny Depp. He died in the town where he was born. He died, I believe, still not fully understanding what he had cost the world, or perhaps understanding it perfectly and choosing, as we all do with the knowledge that most damages us, to hold it at arm's length where it could not quite reach him. The last thing he is recorded as saying publicly, in the manner of a man who has thought about his own mythology, was a version of something he said often in various forms. Over the years, may the wind always be at your back, and the sun upon your face. It is a sailor's blessing, an Irish blessing, a thing men say when they want to wish someone safe passage through uncertain waters. I hope it found him. I hope, wherever he is now, the wind is at his back, and I hope the rest of us, having sat with his story for a while, having looked at it honestly and not flinched away from what it contains, carry something forward from it, not admiration, not condemnation, something harder and more useful than either, something like understanding, the kind that doesn't let you look away. Thank you for being here.